Thank you all for coming tonight. What I will be presenting is a few thoughts, somewhat jumbled, perhaps, on an aspect of the legacy of Abdul'Baha that I just gave, also in somewhat jumbled form, I think, to the Baha'i community of Sweden for their summer school. And this being the 100th anniversary of the passing of Abdul'Baha, it's a moment to pause and reflect on the legacy that Abdul'Baha has left us. And I think first and foremost, we can say that his legacy was in his role as the center of the covenant of the Baha'i faith in preserving its unity in this perilous passage from the origin point of the Baha'i faith with a charismatic prophetic leader, and the passage from that to its current state, which is organized by elected bodies. This passage is something which I think has rarely, if ever, been completed historically, with the faith community intact. It's always a very difficult thing, and Abdul'Baha and his grandson Shoghi Effendi acted to help bridge, I think, that era. And so if we talk about Abdul'Baha's legacy, we would first and foremost mention that. But what I want to talk about tonight is not that. What I want to talk about is something which perhaps might not come to mind as the first thing that Abdul'Baha has left us. And it goes under the title of Abdul'Baha the Philosopher, or maybe even Abdul'Baha the Divine Philosopher. Why would I take this to be a significant part of Abdul'Baha's legacy? He never claimed himself to be a philosopher. If anything, he poked a bit of fun at philosophers in his talks in the West. Said, the cow, happily, munches on its grass, oblivious of the perceptions of the higher realms, and these materialistic philosophers, seem to aspire to be just like cows, to the degree possible, if they can rid themselves of this, detritus of supernatural belief, then they will have come closer to the truth. And Abdul'Baha very much, I guess, pokes fun at that. And he contrasts the materialistic philosophers of the day to what he calls divine philosophers. Without giving us any systematic presentation of what divine philosophy is, he does give us a few hints as to what it is. And he gives us some exemplars in history as to who are divine philosophers. Interestingly, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, he says these were divine philosophers, which is a bit curious because they're well known, of course, in Western philosophy, and they're just considered philosophers in Western philosophy. I think it was Alfred North Whitehead, actually, who said that all of philosophy actually can be regarded as a series of footnotes to Plato. Plato basically, his presentation of the fundamentals of all the branches of philosophy, later really elaborated by Aristotle in a different direction, from metaphysics to ethics to aesthetics and epistemology, all of the main areas that now comprise the foundations of traditional philosophy today were mentioned by Plato. Abdul'Baha calls Plato a divine philosopher, and Socrates, and Baha'u'llah does too. And this actually arises from a tradition in the East that is not the Far East, but the Near East, the Islamic Near East, of categorizing these Western philosophers within and kind of adopting them as one of their own, adopting them as part of the lineage of divine philosophers. Those who were not, did not confine themselves like the cow to only that which the senses can see, but allowed their minds to reach out into higher realms, Plato most famously reached his mind out into the realm of what has come to be called the forms or ideas. And his theory of the forms is still very much alive and well today, and very much debated as one of the first things you learn as a student in philosophy in university. You learn about this idea that behind the physical world and all its multifarious forms, there lies something that explains the patterns that we see. There's something behind the cacophony of appearances that gives order to it. And Baha'u'llah calls this, Abdul'Baha referred to these as archetypal realities, which I think are essentially identical to the forms that Plato talks about. So in what way can we talk about Abdul'Baha's legacy to us and what he's given to us as a philosopher? What I want to propose is the following: that there are contained within, scattered within, maybe even a little bit hidden within, the writings of Abdul'Baha and the talks of Abdul'Baha. And beyond that, of course, the writings of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Elements of what we might call a radical new program of theological and philosophical unification. What Abdul'Baha refers to in one of his talks given in the United States in 1912, he says that Baha'u'llah has united science and religion by revealing the pure teachings of divine reality. Unfortunately, he doesn't go on and say, and these are the pure teachings of divine reality. It's kind of left to us to figure out what they are. But that's the fun of it, is going through this massive ocean, finding the pearls for ourselves, and seeing how they all fit together. I say that this is a radically new approach to unification of religion, unification of science and religion. What could be radically new about it when Baha'u'llah has stated, at least in a couple of places, that there's nothing new about its revelation? Very famously, one of the most, I think, well-known quotations of Baha'u'llah in his book of laws, the Kitab Aqdas, is, "This is the changeless faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future." And in one of his most well-known works, The Hidden Words, he begins by saying, this is what was revealed to the prophets of old, and we're now clothing it in a new garment and presenting it, but it's the essence of what was revealed to the prophets of old. So I guess one place where we have to start is this question of, well, what exactly is new and what is not new about the Baha'i revelation? Because by the words of its own founder, there's really nothing fundamentally new about this. And I think the answer comes in a tablet of Baha'u'llah himself, which was translated by Shoghi Effendi, and it appears in the journal of the Baha'i community of Burma in 1922 or 1923, a very obscure, obviously out of print. I ran across this when I was at the World Center. So it's published, and it's a translation by Shoghi Effendi, and it's never since been republished. But that quotation basically says, I'll paraphrase, this is a pretty close paraphrase. Baha'u'llah says, all of the laws and ordinances, everything from past religions is created anew from age to age. It all changes, except for, Baha'u'llah says, the law of love, which like a fountain is ever renewed and is ceaselessly flowing. So I guess that's a short answer to the question, what is it that's changeless? Everything else changes. Everything else, of course, the social teachings of religions change from age to age, how many wives you can marry, what sorts of foods you can eat, various what Baha'is consider more surface level things. But given this passage by Baha'u'llah where he identifies the only thing that really doesn't change is the law of love, what that also implies, to me at least, is that the theologies themselves are also part of the thing that changes. How we conceive of the Godhead, how we conceive of the nature of the human soul and its relationship to other souls and in a metaphysical sense. What we might think of as a changeless truth, God is one, but it doesn't require us to reach that far back in history before we find that monotheism itself is a fairly new invention. I mean, human history is not that old, but it's old enough to reach back and include the period of time when people worship many gods. It's very easy for us today to sort of laugh it off as a kind of superstition, a childish superstition of the infancy of our species, and that any reasonable person, of course, would conclude that there's only one God, and this must be one of those fundamental teachings that must not have changed. But when one thinks about it, the Baha'i writings also talk about the fact that anything we can know about God is only through the names and attributes of God. And what are these various gods and goddesses of ancient peoples but realizations of different names and attributes of God? In a way, there's something wise about that. And we can also understand something wise about the reduction of these pantheons of gods to a single God in a social sense, because perhaps monotheism lends itself more to humanity advancing to a higher stage of unity. So I just wanted to leave with you the thought that in this, as we investigate what is it that changes and what is it that stays the same, particularly when we're asking ourselves, what is it that's new about the Baha'i faith? Perhaps what actually doesn't change is a very small thing indeed. I mean, small thing to state, but of course it's huge because it's really it's the heart of the whole thing, which is this law of love. But if we accept that thought for the moment, then we can open our minds to the possibility that there is new content, that there are new ideas contained within the Baha'i writings, some of which may have been found in philosophies of the past, some of which may be entirely new. But let's take a moment to ask what some of these ideas might be. On what might we build this program of unification? I think the starting point, at least a good starting point, if not the starting point, and I'm not going to be able to build this out systematically, but I'm just going to end up presenting a half a dozen or so, I think, what I take to be big ideas that I believe will, in the end, be components of whatever systematic philosophy might emerge from all of this. The first is a point of what we might call epistemic humility. We do not have access to ultimate reality, whatever that is. We infer its existence, but we never have and never will have access to ultimate reality. It is ineffable. It is beyond the limits of language. I mean, it's so far beyond the limits of language that it's beyond the categories of grammar that all language necessarily shoehorns everything into. Nouns, verbs, adjectives. Is God a noun? is a question we might ask. Or does God even transcend being a thing? Given that everything that the Baha'i writings say about God is more as attributes of God, so it's almost as if everything we know about God is more in the grammatical category of adjective. Or perhaps, given Baha'u'llah's statement about love being this ever-renewing fountain, that sounds more like a verb, something that's flowing. So maybe God is more of a verb. But the point I'm trying to make is that that divine reality is beyond any of these grammatical categories. So what we're left with is parable. What we're left with is the only way that we've described it in the past, the only way that the sacred writings of the past have been able to approach it is through parables, through imagery, which Abdul'Baha has said is one of the big problems of today, because people have taken those parables, they've taken the imagery, and they've read it out as something literal, as something concrete. And in so doing, they have taken something which is entirely unlimited, and they've confined it within the limitations of the imagery of the language. To put it in another sense, and now moving a little bit more into the realm of science, a very similar problem faces people who are doing science. Nature in itself cannot be observed directly. Nature's laws cannot be observed directly. They are inferred by making a lot of observations. Taking a stab as to what patterns might lie behind those observations that might help unify them, some sort of mathematical relationship, and then testing that against further observations to confirm whether that mathematical relationship holds true or not. But even if a scientist, having gone through this process, comes up with a law that seems to work, the force between two objects in the solar system is proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to their distance, for example, Newton's law of gravitation, which took the work of so many scientists over so many years to come up with, and which for so many years seemed to be the perfect description, the perfectly accurate description of the world as a model. I mean, this relationship is effectively a way of trying to get at nature's laws without actually knowing what nature's laws are. Because it turns out that as we gather more and more knowledge, some of those laws which seemed in the past to be absolutely true and correct end up breaking down in certain ways. The universal law of gravitation from Newton, having lasted a couple of centuries, ends up breaking down in the early 20th century with, first of all, with the theory of Einstein's general relativity, which posits a very different notion of space and time, which are more fluid, which are more interacting, which warp and stretch and twist in ways that Newtonian space doesn't. But this new way of thinking about space and time produces nearly the same results as Newton's, Einstein's theory of space and time produces nearly the same results as Newton's far simpler theory. But in these extreme edge cases, it beats out Newton's theory. But still, Einstein's theory itself only a model. And we know it's only a model because it has to break down in even more extreme circumstances at the edges of black holes, say, or at the earliest moments of the universe, where we know that there has to be some other theory that hasn't yet been discovered that ultimately bridges the gap between gravitation and the other forces of nature. All of this is to say that there's a similar problem. I want to draw a parallel and suggest that there's a similar problem and solution in the scientific enterprise as there is in the realm of religion. And the similar problem is that in both cases, one is investigating a reality to which one does not have direct access, but for which one creates models. And one tests those models. First of all, one always maintains this kind of humility that this is a model, and that a better model may always be found. And secondly, that one tests those models not by simply accepting it on the basis of some authority who says this is the model, but rather one tests it in life, in the case of science, in the laboratory or with special instrumentation. In the case of religion, one tests it by living it out. One tests it by creating and building communities that are centered around these principles and teachings and ideas. And ultimately, the truth or falsity of it is a function of whether it works or not. I believe this is what Baha'u'llah was getting at when he writes to his dear Zoroastrian friend, Manachi Sahib, in the late 1870s, a prominent Zoroastrian, a Parsi Zoroastrian of Indian background, who developed a friendship with Baha'u'llah during the Baghdad years, before Baha'u'llah had declared his mission. And later on, in the 1870s, after Baha'u'llah's prophetic claim became known to Manachi Sahib, he wrote to Baha'u'llah with a number of questions, as though to say, I hear you're a prophet, so maybe you can answer these questions for me. And so he ticks off a bunch of questions for Manachi Sahib, all of which center around, some apparent contradictions, like some people say that the universe is created through bears and monkeys, and some people say the universe was always here, and some people say it was created by some primal will. Well, which is it? Some religions say you can eat pork, and others say you can eat beef. Okay, which one is it? Some people say that God is within all things, like pantheists, and others say that God created the world and just stood back and let the world run itself. And others said that God created the world and continues to guide the world by sending messengers of God, every few centuries. And others really don't talk about God at all. And they say, well, you can just look at the world and it's just cycles of growth and decay and birth and death, and there's really no meaning behind it. Manachi Sahib asked Baha'u'llah this. He said, tell me which of these is the right way to describe the world. And the amazing thing is, Baha'u'llah never, when Manachi Sahib asked him these questions, or when many others asked him similar questions, Jamal Borajerdi asks him in another tablet, he says there's this big disagreement between the Baha'is. Some of them say you're God, and others say, no, you're just the prophet of God. Well, which is it? Like a high and low theophanology, one might say technically, in terms of the meaning of prophethood. For all of these, Baha'u'llah would answer, he might say, well, the exigencies of the day are thus, but in the end, there's truth to be found in all of these perspectives. Baha'u'llah's response was amazingly open, and I think a model for how we can unite the religions and unite science and religion going forward. Not being dogmatic, not insisting that there is a single correct angle, a single correct way of understanding reality, which has to win the day in the end. There'll be some great battle of dogmas, or some great battle and the right one is going to win. Baha'u'llah seemed to be saying something otherwise. He seemed to be saying there are different ways of looking at the fundamental questions, the ones that we think there ought to be an answer to. Baha'u'llah is saying, no, actually, there are different answers to these fundamental questions. And ultimately, it doesn't come down to someone adjudicating which of these fundamental questions is correct. It comes down to the litmus test for them is, are they a remedy to a particular illness? And this was actually his answer to Manachi Sahib, to go back a beat. When Manachi Sahib asked him this whole host of questions, Baha'u'llah initially gives him a very brief reply, in which he says later, the answer to all the questions, there were 9 questions. He said, the answer to all of these lies in the following single statement. Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the day in which you live.
Wow.
And center your deliberations on its exigencies or requirements. But he actually preludes that by saying, and this is part of the answer, I think, in the paragraph before that, he says, the divine physician has his finger on the pulse of mankind. He perceives the illness and prescribes in his infallible wisdom the remedy. And then he says the remedy which previous age may require can never be the same as that which a subsequent age requires. And then he says, be anxiously concerned. So that, in a nutshell, is Baha'u'llah's answer to these incredibly abstruse philosophical questions that they were trying to sort of corral Baha'u'llah into taking a stand and saying, this is the right. And Baha'u'llah didn't do that. And Abdul'Baha didn't do that either. Abdul'Baha also very often, when faced with these sorts of yes or no's, would always answer in some way that validated both of them. As with science, ultimately the litmus test is reality. The litmus test has to be rooted in reality. And so for religion then, it is, does this function as a remedy? Is this solving a problem? Is this improving human life, individually and collectively? Is it resolving inner tensions within individuals? Is it giving them a sense of connectedness with the divine, with what they may call God or may call by some other name? And is it bringing people together? Is it bridging people in ways that between people that may have had differences that seemed unbridgeable in the past? That's ultimately the test that we have. And it's a very pragmatic test. And I think it's fundamentally no different, really, than the test that a scientist makes and the approach that a scientist has. They start with a very similar point of epistemic humility. I don't know, don't have direct access, but I can gather lots of information. I can make some tentative conclusions for that and test those conclusions. And ultimately what I end up with is a model. And it's similarly with religions. Religions then can be thought of as models. Theological systems can be thought of as models, which will rise or fall entirely depending on whether they meet the exigencies of the day. And it may be that certain theological models did just fine 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or certain social norms and mores, certain understandings of the family, or certain understandings of our relationships with others. The evolution from an eye for an eye to turn the other cheek, is one among so many examples of the evolution of morality. And that's boiling it down and maybe oversimplifying it. But I think it's one example of how human morality evolves. And it's not that an eye for an eye was always, fundamentally cruel or fundamentally not merciful or just or what have you. For the time in which an eye for an eye was part of sacred scripture, that was the best, that was the state of the art in human morality. And as human morality evolves, then the responses evolve as well. Okay, so that being said, that what I next want to say, and the few ideas that I want to present next, are all in the spirit of model. So what model then, especially does Abdul'Baha present? A model that may hope to give us, let's say, a large enough theological umbrella within which all the different faith traditions of the planet can find some validation and some home within. What does that theological umbrella look like? And it also has to be a big enough umbrella that it also includes science and the secular worldview within, as Baha'u'llah does in the Tablet to Monarchy Sahib. One of the possibilities of Monarchy Sahib, I think, really wanted Baha'u'llah to exclude was a very kind of agnostic, or let's say even atheistic picture of the world, which doesn't include prophets and God. It just talks about the grass growing in its season and small creatures appearing and disappearing in a pool of water and so forth. In other words, a very agnostic worldview. And Baha'u'llah did not explicitly deny that either. So a secular worldview has to be part of this as well. So what are some elements of this? I'll list a few of them, and then maybe open it up for conversation. And where are these elements to be found? Primarily in some answer questions. Scattered throughout the 84 odd chapters of some answer questions are a number of, I think, building blocks of this new kind of divine philosophy. It is an interesting side note that many years later, in 1919, speaking to Badi Bushri, the father of Sohail Bushri, recently passed, somewhat recently passed, chair of Baha'i Studies at the University of Maryland. His father was Badi Bushri, who spent quite a bit of time in Abdul'Baha's presence towards the last few years of Abdul'Baha's life. And in 1919, Abdul'Baha says to Badi Bushri, in answer to a question about some answer questions, he says, that work was given for the Westerners. He says, for the Easterners, there are these other works, these other tablets, but for the Westerners, there's Mufawwidhat. For the Westerners, there's some answer questions. That's a pilgrim note, so this isn't like the status of the tablet, but Badi Bushri, I think, was a fairly reliable relator of Abdul'Baha's words. I find it plausible that he said something like that. And I find it plausible because some answer questions is different than a lot of other works. I mean, if you go to Abdul'Baha's commentary on the hidden treasure, for example, or Abdul'Baha's commentary on the celestial spheres, his Law Aflakiyya, it's a provisional translation has long been available on the internet called Tablet of the Universe. There are ideas and sort of frameworks in there which are very different from some answer questions. Some answer questions tends to divide things into very clear categories. There are two kinds of knowledge, this and that. There are two kinds of perception, this and that. Everything is very sort of tidy in a way that other tablets aren't quite so tidy. And so I find it plausible that Abdul'Baha, as Baha'u'llah does, speaks in different sorts of languages to different sorts of audiences. Baha'u'llah says this very explicitly at the end of, I think, Epistle to the Son of the Wolf. He says sometimes we speak in the language of the lawgiver and sometimes in the language of the mystic and the truth seeker. Behind it all, there's a unity of mission, but there are different languages. And in the Surah Haykal, the Surah of the Temple, Baha'u'llah also says that our revelation possesses 9 modes. He doesn't say what the modes are, unfortunately. Darn it. And a number of people have come up with ideas of what those 9 modes may mean. There's, but it doesn't really even matter what those 9 modes are. The fact that there are 9 modes is the interesting thing and the important thing, that there are basically different kinds of languages. And I think some answer questions then, and this helps us. It makes life more complicated, but it helps us because it keeps us from being too dogmatic. Even with something like some answer questions, which Shoghi Effendi says is, a fundamental work of the faith. Oftentimes when people would ask him, what should I read to learn about the Baha'i faith? He would say, well, read some answer questions and gleanings and the Kitabi Gan. He would often list certain works, and some answer questions was often listed as a foundational work that Westerners should read to learn about the Baha'i faith. But statements like those recalled by Badi Bushri, I think, keep us from being too dogmatic about it. It keeps us from trying to build it into some sort of crystallized orthodoxy. Instead, we can see these ideas that Abdul'Baha is presenting more as one take, one possible angle that you can get at this multifaceted thing through. So that being said, having kind of pulled the legs out from underneath what I'm going to present next, there's a set of, I believe, pretty neatly connected ideas that one finds, specifically in the chapters of some answer questions, but with a lot of support in other works of Abdul'Baha, and also very much in the works of Baha'u'llah and the Bab as well, which could be said to start with, first of all, the idea of the universe as emanation. It starts with the idea which is familiar to Christians in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In the beginning there was a logos. The Greek in the Gospel of John is logos, which also means an ordering principle. It's been translated as word, but it means something a little bit more than just word. It's like there's a beginning order almost. It comes from the same root as logic. And so Abdul'Baha also talks about in one of the chapters of Some Answered Questions how the universe begins through this active emanation. Almost like the sun casting forth its rays, although as a metaphor, it has its limits and it breaks down at some point. But as far as the metaphor goes, you can think of God as the sun, totally unreachable, could never set foot on it without being burned up long before you reached it. But everything we know about the sun is through the rays of the sun. The attributes of the sun are told through the emanation of the rays. And should the sun for an instant cease to shine, then those rays would in an instant vanish. So the rays of the sun are dependent from moment to moment on the essence of the sun itself. So in like manner, the universe is a product of the will of God, what Abdul'Baha calls the primal will, which is the logos of the Gospel of John, which is this rays of the sun, which undergird all things. And it's important, this is a metaphysical idea. It's not something you can ever measure. It's not something that can ever be seen, or you can't even develop, I don't think you can develop any kind of scientific theory about this. It is a metaphysical substructure which should be accepted or rejected based on whether it works. And whether it works is, does this help solve a problem? Does this structure that Abdul'Baha suggests in Some Answered Questions help solve the problem of religious conflict? Does it help solve the problem of this division between science and religion, between sacred and secular mindsets? And I think it does. I think it at least makes a movement in this direction. So the starting point is emanation. The next point is that emanation, unlike the rays of the sun, which just go out into outer space, the emanation of the will of God is self-referential in a way. It emanates, and what it wants to do, what the emanation wants to do, is return back to its source. In other words, it curves back on itself. Abdul'Baha refers to this in one of the later chapters of Some Answered Questions as arcs of descent and ascent. They comprise a circle. Abdul'Baha doesn't use the phrase, but he could have used the phrase circle of existence to describe this whole cosmology that I'm giving a sort of quick introduction to. The cosmology of the circle. A circle comprising two halves, God at the top, so to speak, not the center in this metaphor, but kind of at the top, and us, human beings, at the bottom. And in between, there's an arc, the descending arc that connects us, and an ascending arc that connects us. The descending arc is the arc of the emergence of the physical universe and the evolution of the physical universe in all its different degrees and stages. From the moment of the Big Bang to the evolution of life on Earth, from the mineral to the vegetable, the animal to the human kingdom, all of that, everything that science knows, and all the forces that scientists are able to discover through the operations of the universe, all of that is the arc of descent. And then here we are at the arc of descent, the human reality, our ability, this amazing, almost mystical ability just to understand it all, to take it in and make these amazing deductions about the patterns that are behind things. But for all this incredible power of the human mind to understand, in a way, encompass the realities that came before us along the arc of descent, powerless to understand the stages that lie in front of us along the arc of ascent, which we call spiritual degrees. It's a term. What does that really mean? Well, one way to answer the question, well, what are spiritual degrees is, well, it's what happens when you ascend the arc of ascent and return back to the origin point. The whole motion of the universe, physical, mental, spiritual, can all be seen as taking place along the circle of existence. It is both physically and spiritually the cosmos continually waking up to its own divinity. It is and it's almost a compulsion within things that it does so. In other words, evolution on all the planets in the universe, wherever possible, ultimately ought to give rise to life forms. And those life forms ought to ultimately gradually increase in complexity, gradually increase in consciousness until they reach that point of self-consciousness, because that is, in a way, the motor force behind the physical laws. It is to use a phrase of Aristotle, it's the telos. It's that, because this is a teleological worldview, I should say, that Abdul'Baha is positing, that the Baha'i writings posit, and that every religion posits, a teleological worldview. Yes, there's all sorts of apparently accidental things that happen in the world, things that we can't understand the deeper meaning behind, all of the suffering in the world, all the way down to just the apparent random motions of atoms. But behind all of those motions, there's a coherence. And that coherence can be seen as we look at the fossil record, as one example, and see this progression from simple beings to more and more complex beings on this planet. Hopefully, maybe during our lifetimes, I hope during our lifetimes, we'll get the first evidence of the existence of life elsewhere. We're trying really hard to find it on Mars. It may or may not ever have existed on Mars. If it did, it probably never went beyond a unicellular state. But efforts are being made elsewhere. The ability to detect extrasolar planets is a huge step forward in this. Perhaps it will be possible during our lifetimes to detect in the atmospheres of distant planets evidences for life through the appearance of methane and free oxygen and other sorts of elements, which may have no natural explanation that we know other than that there must be life on those planets. I believe I would go out on a limb and say that this is, for me, the one solid physical, scientific prediction of the Baha'i writings, of the divine philosophy of Abdul'Baha, would be that, not necessarily that life is on every single planet that we look, because life is not on every patch of ground on the earth that we look. It may be that it's rare because it's just very difficult to, for it to emerge. But I think what we'll find is that life emerges wherever it can. And science will eventually prove or disprove this. If we eventually travel to nearby stars, and if there are planets around those stars that are Earth-like, that are covered with water, and that have these various elements, that have some sort of magnetosphere to protect it from dangerous gamma rays and ultraviolet rays and so forth, I would predict that it's more likely that there's going to be life on that planet than not. And that comes from a metaphysical, position that life and consciousness is somehow embedded within things at the level of the primal world, at the level of that origin point that ultimately explains this whole circle of existence. So I think to try to put it in a nutshell, this circle of existence has such power to unite what might before have seemed ununitable, because it contains within itself the idea of relative truth. What I mean by this in particular is how you look at the world fundamentally, how you divide it up, is a function of where you are in that circle of existence. And this is a really big point. And Abdul'Baha says this in one of his writings. He says, to the vegetable, the animal is the spiritual reality. It's like in one sentence, he blows up all of Western metaphysics. That one sentence. Because Western metaphysics, and I'm thinking especially Cartesian metaphysics, that really had its efflorescence in, say, the 1600s, divides everything up. And a lot of some answer questions seems to do the same thing, right? That's why I think we have to understand some answer questions in context. So many chapters of some answer questions, Abdul'Baha says you have spiritual things and physical things. So you would be forgiven for thinking that that a robust kind of dualism must be part of sort of the Baha'i concept of, that has to feature into any kind of Baha'i philosophy or theology. I don't think that's the case. I think that metaphysical dualism is a great approximation from the standpoint of where we are in this arc of descent, where we are in the circle of existence. Because wherever you are in that circle, your observation of the world is naturally going to divide into two things: whatever came before you and whatever's in front of you, right? So in other words, dualism is not a function of the world, it's a function of the fact that we're moving in a certain direction. And one direction is in front of us and one direction is behind us. But as we continue to progress, how we define material and spiritual is going to evolve as well. And we see this a little bit even within the sort of narrow circumference of human history over the last few thousand years. It wasn't that long ago that things like lightning and earthquakes and the coming of the rains and the rainy season were all attributed to divine forces. It was all, of course, there are gods behind all of these. That's why you sacrifice and pray to the gods to make sure that this, that these things happen, or that you avoid the things that you don't want to happen. And so it's only been in relatively recent times that we've been able to take what used to be firmly in the ambit of the spiritual, the range of action of the gods, and bring it into the realm of science. It's as though we've moved a little bit down along the circle of existence, and now we divide things up a little bit differently. And maybe as we continue to progress further, what now we think of as, oh, that's a spiritual thing. Maybe we're going to find physical explanations for certain aspects of the operation of the human mind, for certain aspects of human consciousness. But if we do that, we should never be threatened. We should never feel threatened that somehow, we only should feel threatened if we hold to this dualistic worldview. Because if we hold to that dualistic worldview, then when certain explanations start coming out that seem quite plausible, then it's the foundations of our understanding of the world, if they're based on this kind of metaphysical dualism, will be threatened. But if we understand that these things are all relative, then we're not threatened at all by whatever science manages to understand about the deepest secrets, the deepest mysteries of say, human consciousness. So take that idea then of relativity, which is intrinsic to the idea of the circle of existence, and now just apply it everywhere. It applies, then we understand that the relativity of religious truth through a new kind of eyes. It enables us to validate such a diverse collection of viewpoints that we never could have validated before. And I believe that is a key to how we're eventually going to unite the world. How is the faith going to unite the world? I can think of two ways. One is we're going to produce the correct dogma, the correct belief, and everyone is eventually going to be forced to realize that this is the one true belief. Or we are going to present a way of looking at spiritual reality that actually validates all the existing beliefs. In other words, the Buddhists are not going to have to say, oh, we were wrong about God all along. And now we're going to, all of this stuff about atheism and that sort of agnosticism of Buddhism, yeah, we were wrong about all of that. And now we believe in the robust monotheistic God of the New Testament and the Quran and the Baha'i rites. Is that what lies in the future for a billion people, the billion Buddhists in the world? Is that what lies in the future for, the Taoists and the Hindus and others who also do not have the same, they come from a culturally distinct way of accessing the divine, which is simply not on the surface or even many layers beneath compatible with the theology of Judeo-Christian Islamic religions. And that, I think, is like one of the biggest questions we have to ask is, if the world is going to come together, that divide has to be bridged. And we're either going to bridge that divide by some sort of capitulation of one side saying we were wrong and now we're coming over to this side, or as I'm suggesting, it's going to be a whole different sort of process. It's going to be a process of realizing, oh, all of these different ways of looking at God are all true and correct within their point of view. And ultimately what the world needs today is not the correct dogma, but it just needs a lot more love and a lot more understanding that where people are coming from is valid from their own point of view. We see Baha'u'llah, we see Abdul'Baha answering in these sorts of terms over and over in the mystical writings of Baha'u'llah, also the Seven Valleys, Gems of Divine Mysteries, the works compiled in what is now called the Call of the Divine Beloved. I think one can see that not just as, let's say, a mystical textbook, for the seeker to sort of your guide through the valleys, but you can also see it as a radical social document, a blueprint, an ethical blueprint for how to relate to people who believe things which seem completely incompatible with your own beliefs. This is one of the, something that's so beautifully stated in one of these newly translated tablets in Call of the Divine Beloved. Baha'u'llah says, basically, it is I'm going to roughly translate Baha'u'llah saying, it is a feature and not a bug of human life and existence that there will be irreconcilable differences. Wow. He said, that is how it is. He says, so what is to be done? Be forbearing, be loving, be forgiving of others. The solution is not convince them that they're wrong and then bring them into the ambit of the one true religion. It's be loving and tolerant and forbearing. That's ultimately the solution. And so probably I've gone on enough to for one session, I guess. So I wanted to, I basically wanted to present this idea of the circle of existence as being a new kind of metaphor for understanding the big picture. It includes the physical world and the spiritual world. It includes science and religion. It includes evolution. And this is the faith of evolution, both embraced in the physical sense, as well as very much in the spiritual sense. And it also is this imagery of the circle also helps resolve this conflict between dualism and monism, which, I mean, when we read about in the media, the huge divisions in the world, between, there's political divisions, and when we hear about larger divisions, it's often between, say, Islam and Christianity. That's like, those are two close cousins, brothers even, when it comes to theological system. I mean, the way they look at the world is so similar. The way they look at the nature of the prophet, divine revelation, a book with laws, an ecclesiastical hierarchy. I mean, all of it is so similar. And if that is what we're looking at now as being the unbridgeable gulf, then what greater chasms remain to us when the East truly starts interfacing with the West? And I'm talking the Far East now, and the ways of thinking and being which characterize the religions of Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism. We're not hearing about that chasm. I think we will in the future, and when that happens, I think we'll have ideas like this from the Baha'i writings that can offer this larger sort of umbrella with it, which it can all be validated. So why don't I just stop there? I mean, there's so much more to say, but this will continue a bit with a shift in emphasis on Sunday, talking now about Abdul'Baha as mystic. And I'm not sure what it said in the email, but the thought was this would be Abdul'Baha's philosopher, divine philosopher. And then moving to specifically dimensions of personal spirituality, mystical dimensions, particularly the dissolution of consciousness and the recognition of the oneness behind things and so forth, and mystical experience that Abdul'Baha talks about a lot on Sunday. And then on the final session will be Abdul'Baha as teacher and exemplar. So thanks for making it tonight.
But you have some
Any thoughts?
questions.
Yeah, there's time for questions.
Right?
Yeah.
Seven Valleys, is that is that the ascent part of the circle in your mind, or is it like a
That's certainly one way to look at it. I know Nader Saidi in Logos of Civilization gives a diagram of the circle of existence, and he had that similar idea, and he put 7 degrees on the way down, which are, it's a whole other topic of a bunch of terms that come from Arabic, and the 7 degrees on the way up, he put the 7 valleys. So others have had that same idea. Although the 7 valleys are, just as with all of these other frameworks, not the final word. I mean, it's what Baha'u'llah wrote to a particular person of Sunni persuasion at a particular time. And years later, actually, Baha'u'llah, referring to the 7 valleys, says, we wrote the 7 valleys to someone with a Sunni persuasion in accordance with their thoughts and conceptions. Said, but if you recognize this most great revelation, you will traverse all 7 valleys.
So it's just a model.
It's just a model.
For many,
It's a model.
many different types of
And it's a model that is patterned or very strongly echoes Attar's Conference of the Birds. It's almost as though he's taking an existing model that his audience would have been well familiar with. You know, the dervishes of the mountains of Kurdistan, and you know, those that he was really speaking to during those years, and delivering to them new content, but in the sort of in the outward structure of the old. And really what the 7 valleys is doing, I think if you look kind of beneath the surface, is, yeah, it can be read as a mystical text for, you know, for the individual seeker, but much more deeply, he's preparing the ground for the whole idea of the unity of the prophets. And the idea that there are different ways of approaching God, you know, one through the eye of distinction, one through the eye of unity. And Baha'u'llah is trying to prepare the ground for understanding his own claim, which hasn't yet been voiced yet. So I think there's, as is often the case with Baha'u'llah's writings, there's more than one thing going on. He himself says that there's 72 meanings, you know, to every verse.
Also, something on when you said what's actually new. There isn't a passage that talks about how all previous revelations have given 2 letters, and Baha'u'llah has now given the 26.
All the rest, all the alphabet. Yeah.
So yeah, how do you think of that versus what you kind of laid out?
Yeah. Well, the 2 could be that law of love, but then what are the remaining 24 letters? You know, perhaps it's these elements of divine philosophy that we still have yet to sort of even identify all the pieces of.
It's interesting to think that there is a binary language made of zeros and ones, in which everything can be expressed.
Wow.
There is a binary language of zeros and ones in which everything can be expressed. The reason I'm saying that, 2 letters are enough to express the entirety of the reality.
Yeah.
Wow.
Never was it incomplete for the needs of the time. But now you can have a level of richness and a level of differentiation and ease. Because of course it is much longer to write things in zeros and ones, but if you have 26 letters, you can express much more density.
I like that.
So it's not, for me, it's not about, oh, these were 2 things and these were added. I think it's about sort of the combinatorial possibilities, the fact that, you know, you reach the same thing but much deeper, much faster, with greater ease, with greater diversity, etc.
So, you brought up something I've been meditating on for several years, but the idea that one of the attributes of God is questions, but an attribute of God is not answers. And we so often give answers rather than ask questions. And I started listening to you and thinking, this is part of it, isn't it? It's at learning to ask. It's hard. I teach stuff in college students, and it took me 3 years of intense effort to be able to start asking more questions, because we're so much into this, just answers. But do you have any thoughts about how to make that shift?
In our like day-to-day
Yeah,
lives.
yeah. And
It's certainly,
Don't give an answer, that was a trap. Sorry, my good friend, I have to.
well, I was gonna, the direction I was gonna go is, I mean, like, let go of the idea that we have the answers. You know, we Baha'is have the answers for, you know, for all of the problems of humanity or something like that. We have a spark, you know, we have something precious that can be shared with others that is enlivening and that's unifying. But the answers, we have to get through the usual hard process of consulting and deciding the wrong thing, figuring it out again. But you know, through the process of putting our minds together and our hearts together, keeping ourselves always open to what's new. And that's the hardest thing. It's always staying open to what's new and always being willing to change. And now, I'm now, I can say I'm now, I guess, old enough to say that I've started to see this through a lens I never saw before. That there are those who don't change, and there are those who do. And it's a much more rare thing to change, and it's a much more common thing to stay the same. And I see this now in relationship, you know, people I've known forever. And it's a comforting thing. It's like they never change, yeah. And it's kind of nice to think that, to come back at 20 years. You know, I went back to a high school reunion not long ago, and I saw a bunch of people that I knew before. And the first thing that struck me was, none of them have changed. And it was great because you could immediately fall into a sort of pattern of conversation, and instantly we're right there where you were back. And then, so that was my first thought. And then my second thought, which was a scarier one, was, have I really changed? Because I would like to say that I've changed and evolved, but people often lack the power of introspection to really answer that question.
One of the things I always think about is the line from Abdul'Baha. This is that most great beauty for told in most messages, truth shall be distinguished from error. And something that I feel like I've been grasping with for a while is how to weigh and assess scientific claims, philosophical claims that are outside of the revelation, in context of the principles of revelation. You know, tell the universe, there's kind of like these 4 methodologies that are given. It talks about how Copernicus, because he observed small observations meticulously over time, could then assess a general principle. But I guess I was just wondering, like, if there are any gleanings of how we use Abdul'Baha's elements of divine philosophy to assess, you know, like what a psychologist says a healthy relationship looks like, or what science says about the nature of gender identity, or you know what biologically is seen about abortion. You know, like all these issues that today are really, yeah. And I just wonder about how we, if there's anything in that about how we kind of weigh and assess truth claims.
I can only speak to my own experience going through, you know, an undergraduate and graduate program in the sciences, in physics. And initially, when I first started learning Arabic and Persian, I first started reading all of these tablets, like the Tablet of the Universe and others. I still remember my first encounter with the Tablet of the Universe. It was like my last year at university. And I remember just being blown away and thinking, wow, the blueprint of future physics is here, you know. And I spent years actually meticulously and systematically reading all of the writings and categorizing them, according to all subject matter, particularly as relates to wherever it might touch upon the sciences, wherever it might touch upon descriptions of the physical world from which I might read out, insights, who knows, equations, whatever, that would unlock some mysteries in the physical world. And I have to say that the deeper I got into it, the less convinced I became that was the right way to approach it. And the more convinced I became that these, that scientific discoveries are best left to the scientists, because of the way that scripture can be read. It can be read in so many different ways, and it's very often in the 2020 hindsight we can find things. Oh, see, it said that all along. But if you were there before that scientific discovery was made, what's the chance that you would actually have taken that particular bit of scripture and read that in the right way? Almost no. So I guess I would say that my personal experience has been one of disappointment on that particular sort of angle, where that but at the same time, immense sort of joy and sort of sense of mystery on a whole nother plane. That once I stopped trying to read out like specific scientific knowledge or historical knowledge or whatever out of the writings, and started seeing it more as it's offering us like a kind of a model for understanding some of the deeper problems that face the human race, such as this idea of the circle of existence is an example of something that I think is embedded in the Baha'i writings. Most Baha'is don't pay it much attention. I do believe it has great potential, but its potential is not because it's kind of reading out something about the physical world. It's a model. It's a metaphysical model that cannot be proven or disproven, as is. It's logically consistent. I mean, the one thing you can do is ask if it's logically consistent or not, and it's logically consistent. And then beyond that, all you can really ask is, does this thing work? In the implementation of it. And by implementation of it, when these ideas are shared, are people enlivened by them? Do people want to take it further? Do people start looking at others, from across the bridge or from across the ocean or whatever, with a little bit more understanding and empathy? If that's the case, then it works. Then the model works. That's the ultimate test. But anyway, that's just speaking from my experience. Trying to find the string theory in the writings or something like that.
I don't think that's not a question to find string theory in the writings.
Well, I was answering from my own
That you were
experience.
So because I have two things. It's interesting. The actual answer, I think, Stephen gave earlier, and it's corroborated by what Shoghi Effendi says. He said the Baha'i faith is scientific in its method. He actually uses the word scientific. So rather than things going in this direction, it comes in this other direction.
Right.
In other terms, it's exactly the same logic. Whatever makes more sense, better sense of more data points, and gives you more power to act, that's dynamically the truth. You know what I mean? Sort of it's that the standard for spiritual and material, etc., is not different. One thing, as you were saying, which was very, very interesting in terms of truth not being this thing that is existent, but what is being built through a process. There is this amazing tablet of Abdul'Baha which has not been translated. And it starts with حقیقت واقع این است. It can be translated as the truth of the matter. The plain truth is. And of course, this is an amazing start. So, okay, I want to know what the plain truth is. And it says that we will unite and we will dispel differences and we will do it's all future. After that, it's all future tense of what we will do and how this will bring all of us together. And this is the reality and this is the truth. and it is in the future, and it's not something that, I'm stating today. I thought that was an amazing vista in terms of, truth is a dynamic thing. Truth is what is built. Truth is what is collectively built through a process of investigation, of unity, of bringing different things together, etc. And it's not just sort of say, okay, when it says truth will be distinguished from error, it's through engaging in the right process that truth will be built inside you, and you will see more clearly that it's the other.
There is such a thing as error.
Yes. I don't know, just, going back to that quote, and also with Dorothy's question that she asked about questions. Every age has its own problems, but it follows up with every soul its particular aspiration. And I think that passage, particularly why it rings so deeply for me, is because Baha'u'llah says, forget about all of this theoretical stuff. To me, religion becomes what is before you and dealing with the shiftingness as it relates to society and the individual, and it lies in that love and relationship. So I think the questions, to me, the answer is found as it relates to what's that next little bit that brings that soul closer to God, or that community through a particular ailment. And to me, it's like, that's when, Baha'u'llah says that faith, that fewness of words and abundance of these questions that we have. The most relevant question is, what does it relate to that person, or what does it relate to that particular thing that we're going through? And then we continue to evolve. The more we get out of this futuristic, deep thinking, and we get more focused in on the present, I think that's where things just get resolved. And to me, that's the nature of religion and how it gets practically applied to the advancements of our souls.
You had a thought on that.
Yes, a small nuance on one of the things that you said. So fundamentally agree with the spirit that the idea is a tent that allows to bring all of humanity in. I think it's much more at the level of the individual differences than the collective differences. Because, I wouldn't talk about, okay, all the Buddhists think this, or all the Christians think this, etc. Of course, each one of the religions, each one of the traditions has a central mode or a central, but this passage said each soul. And I think the differences that you find within a given tradition are actually greater than among traditions. So I think, this is a small nuance. I think the tent is huge because human souls are different, not because different traditions have taken a given mode and blown it given the exigencies of the time or a dominant tone. I think that's true, but I think it's even truer that, what we want to make possible is very different temperaments that exist in all traditions. And my metaphor is, you can have very different CPUs. As long as you have a common operating system, you can build all the things on top. It all works. It's all interoperable. We don't want to make the CPUs one. We don't want to say everybody has to process in the same fashion. They're very different capabilities. So this plurality for me is first and foremost plurality of individuals. And then the traditions to a certain extent, but individual over anything, because ultimately the true diversity is among, this is something like, this is the humans are the beings where every single individual is a species. So it's sort of, that is a lot different. So that was one nuance that I thought is.
Maybe we can take a little break and have, unless there's like some burning questions people want, but then continue while we have refreshments.
You're gonna have this recording available.
Yes, that's my hope, if my technical setup actually works.
I
I do have to, yeah, we should end.
You can ask it a question to your computer.
Oh no, stop the recording first.
Oh, okay, you do, I don't want
Yeah,
to
yeah,
mess
yeah.
anything up. You should do it.
Myself.